I'd love to introduce you to Breda Carney, and she's going to be talking to you about clinical evaluation for SAMD. It's over to you.
Great, thanks a million, Katie, and thanks to everyone for joining today. So as Katie mentioned, my name is Breda Carney, and I'm a clinical regulatory lead at BSI. And basically what I do is provide regulatory support to all of our internal clinicians and our clinical reviewers who are responsible for reviewing all of our different types of devices. So today I want to cover software as a medical device and particularly focus on the clinical evaluation requirements and just try to simplify the process for how you develop your clinical evaluation for these types of devices. Because based on our experience, what we generally see is the technical side of software is very strong, but where manufacturers find that they're challenged, it's trying to put together the clinical evaluation. So that's why we're going to focus on that side of it today. So, of course, important disclaimer, because we're in the EU, everything is always changing in Europe, particularly with guidance documents coming out all of the time and new implementing regulations and so on. So everything that I share with you today is based on our current understanding and interpretation of the regulations. So the very first question you always need to ask when you're starting off your clinical evaluation is, first of all, is my device actually regulated under the MDR? So is my software, is it actually a medical device in its own right, or is it something that's supporting another type of device? So in order to answer that question, there's two really good guidance documents that I want to draw your attention to. The first one is MDCG 2019-11, and the second one is MDCG 2020-1. And both of these guidances, they go through the steps for how you determine how do you regulate your software as a medical device. So do you require a standalone clinical evaluation, or do you require a clinical evaluation in combination with another type of device? So it's always worth having a look at those guidance documents first to find out where your device actually sits. The other important thing is for your device to fit in under MDR, it has to actually have a medical effect. So it has to do something medical, and it has to meet the definition of a medical device, which can be found in Article 2. And essentially, it's any type of software that's involved in primarily diagnosis, monitoring, prediction, prognosis of disease or disabilities. We wouldn't so much obviously see anything to do with investigation, replacement, or modification of the anatomy with the nature of software as a medical device. So typically it's everything to do with diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, predicting, prognosis of different types of disease. So again, definitely worth having a look at those two guidance documents. So first of all, starting off with clinical evaluation. So what exactly is it? Well, the MDR tells us that it's a systematic and planned process to continuously generate, collect, analyze, and assess clinical data on your device. And the important things here is that it's systematic. So it does follow a systematic process. It has to be planned. So we're going to need to have a plan for how we're going to do it. It is continuous, which means we don't just do it once. We have to repeat it several times throughout the lifetime of the device. And the whole purpose of it is to generate, collect, and analyze and assess clinical data about our device. The reason that we're doing this is in order to verify, so to confirm that the device is safe, that it performs as intended, and that it actually delivers a clinical benefit when it's used as intended. So that's what a clinical evaluation actually is. And keep an eye out for, there's a new ISO standard coming out called ISO 18969, which is focused on clinical evaluation. And it's going to provide a lot more guidance on the clinical evaluation process. So just keep an eye out for that ISO standard. So looking at the process of how it actually works. So we start off with, we have a clinical evaluation plan. So it's like everything in quality management systems or science, you always need a good plan. And the plan is going to tell you what data do you need to get, how are you going to get it, how are you going to analyze it, what conclusions do you need to draw. Then based on your plan, you go out, identify what data do we actually have. You then appraise that data. So you look at it in terms of the quality of the data. So is it good quality data? Is there limitations to the data? How much of it do I have? And so on. If you need to, you'll generate new data. So if there's any gaps or holes, you might need to do a clinical investigation. When you then have your full data packet, you'll analyze it, and then you'll generate your clinical evaluation report. So you start off with a plan to map out what you're going to do. Then you implement your plan by identifying the data, appraising it, get new data if you need it, analyze it, and then you write up a report at the end, which is a summary of all of your analysis and your conclusions. And then you go back and you start the whole thing again, and the cycle goes around and around. So the important thing is, though, for standard medical devices, generally what we're trying to do is to verify that device is safe, performs as intended, and that it delivers a clinical benefit. With software, it is a little bit different. Specifically with software, what we're looking for is, do we have enough clinical evidence to establish that there's a valid clinical association between the output and a clinical condition? And I'll explain these terms in a bit more detail in a moment. So we need to establish if there's a valid clinical association. We then need to demonstrate performance, but it's both technical performance and clinical performance. And then lastly, we have to demonstrate that the benefit risk is considered acceptable. So that's an important difference between software as a medical device versus other types of medical devices. There's 4 things we're trying to prove. We have to show clearly that there's a valid clinical association, demonstrate the technical performance, demonstrate the clinical performance, and then, as for all devices, demonstrate that the benefits of using it outweigh the risks. So if we look at those terms in a little bit more detail, what exactly are we looking for? With a valid clinical association, the question that we're trying to answer is there a clinically accepted or well-founded association between the output of the software and the targeted physiological state or clinical condition? So in other words, whatever your software is actually reporting, so the output, is that actually clinically relevant? That's what you're trying to find out. That's what the valid clinical association means, that the output, so what I'm reporting on, it's clinically relevant. Technical performance then asks, does this device accurately, reliably, and precisely generate the intended output from the input data? So I put data in, can I reliably, predictably generate the output? And then clinical performances, I take the software, I put it into the hands of the clinician or whoever's meant to be using it in the clinical setting. it's used as intended, and does it yield a clinically relevant output? So does it actually provide a clinical benefit? So those are the three things that we're trying to prove from our clinical evaluation, that there is a valid association between the output and a clinical condition. So the report, or what's reported, the results, it actually means something. The technical performance, that the output, we can reliably, precisely generate an output from the input. And then clinically, when I put this software into the clinical environment, it does what it's meant to do. It's clinically relevant. It provides a clinical benefit to the patient. So how do you do that? So if we first start with the valid clinical association, the types of data that you can use or how you go about it, essentially it's a lot of it's in your state-of-the-art analysis. And I'll talk a little bit more about state-of-the-art later on. But a lot of the valid clinical association comes from your state-of-the-art analysis. So you're generating systemic literature reviews, looking at professional medical society guidelines, technical standards, or you might have proof of concept studies or clinical investigations from the device. And again, the whole point is you need to show whatever result is being reported, it's clinically relevant. So generally, literature reviews, medical guidelines, standards, so on. Technical performance then, that's fairly straightforward. A lot of you will probably have heard of the standards IEC 62304 and IEC 82304, so the software development standards. So it's your verification and validation testing. That's how you do your technical performance. Another way of doing it, or in addition, is retrospective analysis of labeled data sets. So if you already have, let's just say, images or data that with a known truth, so you already know what the output is supposed to be, or it could be references or so on from, or you could have data from a curated database or a registry. So data that's labeled, you already know what the output is. You can push that through your software, and that can be used to demonstrate technical performance. So again, demonstrating that when I put these samples, that I know the answer, I know what it's supposed to be. When I push them through, I can accurately predict the answer and get it. It's reliable. Clinical performance then is we're going to the clinical setting. So I'm generating data from using the device or an equivalent device in the target population for the intended use, per the intended use conditions. So in the hospital or in the triage room or in the emergency room or wherever it's meant to be used, or by lay persons and by the intended users. So this is your clinical investigations. So this is where I suppose this is the part that manufacturers generally struggle with when it comes to doing their clinical evaluation for software. The valid clinical association, that's straightforward. Technical performance is straightforward, and manufacturers generally they're strong on technical performance, but it's the clinical performance is the hard part. It's hard to get your head around it, but it's all about when I put this medical device into the hands of the people that are meant to be using it and it's used as intended, what actually happens? Is it providing a clinical benefit? So with my clinical evaluation, so now that we've looked at those different types of concepts, what I'll go through now is I suppose, what we would consider the 5 basic steps or simple steps for how you would put together a clinical evaluation. And just to note, this is very simplified, but it'll just give you an idea of how you would go about doing a clinical evaluation for your device. The very first thing is the intended purpose and the clinical benefit. So making sure that once you've determined, yes, my device is a medical device, it meets the definition per MDR Article 2, it's going to be regulated by the regulation, I'm going to need a standalone clinical evaluation for it. The next thing I need to do is define what is the intended purpose and what is the clinical benefit for the device. So looking at the intended purpose, this, I would say the intended purpose is probably one of the biggest, I suppose one of the main deficiencies that we see when it comes to looking at clinical evaluations for not just software, but for all types of medical devices. But it's really, really important that you have a very clear, precise, specific intended purpose. And the intended purpose is essentially, what is the device intended to do? So what's it actually going to do? And the important thing is that in the official definition, it says, according to the data that's supplied by the manufacturer on the label, the IFU, the promotional or sales materials or statements. So it's in all of your marketing material, all of your IFUs, all of your documents. What are you telling people that this device is for? What is it actually doing in the clinical setting? And you need to be very precise, because if you're vague, it always causes issues when it comes to the notified body reviewing your files. The reason is your intended purpose is really what sets you up. It decides what the risk classification of your device is, and it's what qualifies your device as a medical device. So those are two very important things. The intended purpose will qualify your device as a medical device, and it will help with the classification of the device. And from that, we'll determine how much clinical evidence you're going to need. So it's very important to have it right from the start. So what I have here is examples of 2 different types of intended purposes. They're a little bit wordy, but it's just to kind of give you an idea of, this is how specific your intended purpose really needs to be. So the first one says that the device is intended for use by dentists to display, annotate, store, and make measurements and visualization adjustments of digital images and/or videos previously generated during the dental practice by X-ray radiography, oral scans, oral videos, and/or CT scans, and subsequently imported to the software to support image diagnosis. So it's a bit of a mouthful. There's a lot in it, but you should be hopefully you can see from that intended purpose, you're very, very clear what this device actually does and what it does not do, where it's to be used, who's going to be using it, and so on. The next one I have, it's a different type of device, and this one is intended to analyze fetal ultrasound images and clips using machine learning techniques to detect standard biometry views. Upon detection, the device assists in measurement computation of fetal biometric parameters, i.e. the head circumference, abdominal circumference, femur length, and parietal, it's a big word, diameter. So again, you can see it's very specific. From reading that, you know exactly what this device is going to do, you know what it's not going to do, and who's meant to be using it. And this is really important for your intended purpose, that it's very, very clear, specific, and if it's vague, you are going to get a lot of scrutiny from the notified body, a lot of questions, a lot of pushback. And again, the whole purpose of having a clear intended purpose is it's going to determine the risk classification of your device. It'll qualify you as a medical device, and it'll also help to determine how much clinical evidence you're going to need. For anyone who's heard of the MedDev 271 Rev 4, if you have a look at section A3, there's a lot more examples of different types of intended purposes as well, so it's worth having a look at that section as well. So once we're clear on our intended purpose, we then need to determine what is the clinical benefit of our device. So the definition for a clinical benefit, it's the positive impact of the device on the health of an individual, expressed in terms of a meaningful, measurable, patient-relevant clinical outcome, including outcomes related to diagnosis or a positive impact on patient management or public health. Again, that's all a bit of a mouthful. The important things here are that it has to be patient-relevant clinical outcomes. And this is where the problem can be with software as a medical device. Because generally, the clinical benefit from software as a medical device, it comes from providing information, which is then used to inform on clinical decision making. And it's the subsequent medical devices that are used to treat the patient that actually provide the patient relevant clinical outcome. So when you're talking about the clinical benefit for software as a medical device, you need to look at MDCG 2020-1 because it's the guidance document that talks about how you do clinical benefit for these types of devices. And basically in there, it tells you that for these types of devices, you can define your clinical benefit as providing information to support diagnosis. So if I look here, these are just some examples of clinical benefits that I pulled just from some devices, just to give you an idea of what a clinical benefit could be for software. So the first one here is reduce the time to report on studies that contain critical pathology. So that's a benefit. So we're reducing the time that it takes to report on studies that contain a critical pathology. Improve clinician accuracy in detecting pathologies from a medical image, so improving the clinician accuracy. Aid in the generalization of standardized reports by automatic detection and categorization of coronary stenosis and characterization of arteriosclerotic plaque. So again, they're just some examples. They're all to do with providing information. And that's one of the differences between software as a medical device versus a standard medical device. So I have the reference there, MDCG 2020-1, which tells us that for software as a medical device, the benefit may lie in providing accurate information for patients. The final clinical outcome will be dependent on further diagnostic and or therapeutic actions. So again, it's just because for software as a medical device, the official definition of a clinical benefit talks about you have to have patient relevant clinical outcomes, but this can be very challenging for software as a medical device because generally the benefits are that we provide medical information, but per the guidance document, that's permitted. The other important thing to point out here is for a lot of software devices that come in, we see in the clinical evaluation that the manufacturer will claim that there's no clinical benefit for the patient, but all medical devices must have a clinical benefit. That's the whole underlying premise of being a medical device. You have to provide a clinical benefit, some type of benefit to the patient. All right, so it can be direct or indirect, but every device provides a clinical benefit. So if you say that your device doesn't provide a clinical benefit, it will be challenged by your notified body. Right? So once we have very clear, this is my intended purpose, this is the clinical benefit, the next thing I need to do is move on and do the state of the art and define my objectives. So the state of the art is probably one of the most critical parts of your whole clinical evaluation. And essentially what it is you're looking at the clinical landscape and you need to identify, where does my device fit? Where does it sit? So you're looking at, well, what's the clinical condition that this device is intended for? What are the alternative treatment options? So if you didn't have my software, what would the clinical care pathway look like? So if I take my software out, what's the alternative? What are the other types of software or tools or methodologies that are available instead of my software? So that's what state of the art is all about. You're looking at, it's almost like doing an industry analysis, and you're looking to see, where does my device sit within the industry? Where is it going to actually sit? From the state of the analysis, so this is where you're doing your robust literature searches. Then from your state of the analysis, you're going to define objective criteria, which then you're going to use to demonstrate that this software is better than or equal to what is currently available. So that's essentially what you're trying to do. You have to show that looking at all of the different alternatives, looking at similar devices, looking what's existing. When I introduce my software, it performs at least as well, if not better, than everything else that's out there on the market. That's what your state of the art is all about. And essentially what you have is, I've tried to depict it in this image here, but you will have clinical data from your subject device. You're going to be showing that based on the clinical performance, you will have a clinical benefit, and we're going to measure that by clinical outcomes. You're then going to have safety. You're going to be showing that your device is safe, so it's free from unacceptable clinical risks. We'll then look at, well, looking at what benefits does the device provide. We'll weigh them up against the residual risks, because every device, including software as a medical device, there is always going to be some risk associated with it. So we'll look at, what are the benefits of using my device compared to the risks? Do they outweigh them? And then we're going to compare that to benchmarks, similar devices, or alternatives. So how does my device compare to what's currently out there on the market, and alternatives, and the standard of care pathways, and so on? So that's why state of the art is so important. It's essentially, you have to demonstrate that my device is as good as, if not better than, the current state of the art. And you do that by setting performance objectives and safety objectives and associated acceptance criteria, and then collecting data on your device to show that you've met those criteria and comparing it to the state of the art. So this is just an example. It's a scenario type example of a novel, it's a novel device. So it's a software as a medical device which has integrated AI. And again, this just shows when you're doing state of the art, this is the thinking process behind it. So this software device, so it's highly novel. It's used to detect nodules, tumors, and other features in an X-ray. It's intended to be used by a radiologist to perform an initial assessment of the image, and the claims are that it improves the rate of detection of the diseases X, Y, and Z, and it reduces their radiologist assessment time. So if that's my device, questions that I'm asking when I'm doing my SOTA are, what specific types and states of disease is this device intended to detect? So you're looking at what are the clinical conditions that it's going to detect? What are the current processes that this technology is intended to disrupt or improve? So what's currently out there and what will my technology do? How will it compare? And then what devices are available that perform a similar job? So who are my competitors essentially? From that, so from all of that analysis, I'll be able to determine what are the benefits of the device, what are the related risks, how will I measure performance, so how will I know it's working, what are the relevant endpoints, how is it going to be used, including where and how in the process to realize the benefit, and what type of data do I need. It'll also help to tell me how novel is the device. So is there something particularly novel about our device compared to what's currently out there? And then if there is, that's going to require higher levels of evidence. So hopefully that makes sense and helps to put it into context on what exactly the state of the art is. So once we have our intended purpose, our benefits, we've defined what the state of the art is, we've determined how we're going to measure that our device is safe, so we know what objectives we're going to use, we know what our acceptance criteria is, we know how we're going to measure performance, we know how we're going to compare our device to what's currently out there. Our next step then is to generate our clinical data. So from state of the art, you'll generate objectives, and then you need to gather the data to demonstrate your device is safe and performs as intended. So I'm sure most people will know the definition of clinical data. It comes straight from the MDR, and essentially it is data that's generated from use of your device. So you get it from clinical investigations. Clinical investigations or other studies that are reported in the literature, or for equivalence, it could be from reports published in peer-reviewed scientific literature on clinical experience of the device, or clinically relevant information that comes from your post-market surveillance, in particular post-market clinical follow-up. So that's all very straightforward. This is the important slide. What is not clinical data? So clinical data is not considered to be expert opinion on your device that's not related to clinical experience. Compliance with standards. So if you're claiming compliance to 62304 or the usability standards, that's not clinical data. Clinical experience that hasn't been published generally wouldn't be accepted as clinical data. And then this is important here, this final step, the output of running retrospectively collected data through an algorithm on a bench. So retrospective analysis. So what they're talking about here is a lot of the times with software, you can demonstrate technical performance, by taking images or data that's been pre-labeled and you know the results, what they're expected to be, and you can train your algorithm based on that data set. So it's like your known truth. So you can train your algorithm using the known truth or the reference images, and then you can have a subset of images that you can use as your testing data, and you can push that through the algorithm to see, does it work? Is it giving me the expected results? That's used to demonstrate technical performance, but it's not considered clinical data. And that's an important distinguishing feature to make, that type of retrospective analysis, it's very informative for technical performance, but it's not going to tell us clinical performance. It's not clinical data. All right, so pushing images through to train your algorithms and then to test your algorithms, technical performance, but it's not clinical performance. And we'll talk about that later on. I have some case study examples to show you. So the main question that we always get as a notified body is, well, how much data do we need? And I do a lot of structured dialogue calls, and this is by far the main question that we get. How much data do I need in order to get this device over the line? And the simple answer is, there is no simple answer. So with sufficient clinical evidence, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. It really depends on the type of device. It depends on your intended purpose. It depends on the classification. It depends on how it's going to be used in the clinical care pathway and so on. So I have a couple of examples actually it starts on the next slide. I'll just go through this one first, but I do have a couple of examples that I'm going to show you, just showing different types of devices and how much clinical evidence was actually provided. So first of all, though, just to touch on this slide, sufficient clinical evidence, it's one of those phrases that they put into the MDR and they didn't define it. But if we go to MDCG 2020-6, it's tried to help us out by providing a definition for what it is. And it basically says it's the result of the qualified assessment which has reached the conclusion that the device is safe and achieves the intended benefits. Personally, I don't think that really helps us out. It's all kind of a bit vague. But if we go further, we can see that when we talk about sufficient clinical evidence, what we're actually talking about is quality and quantity. So we're talking about having data, sufficient quantity of data, which is of sufficient quality. So when we talk about quality, what you're talking about is the data reliable? Is it statistically valid? Is it a complete data set? Is it relevant, legible? Is it accurate? Was it collected ethically? Is it up to date? And is it correct? So think in terms of like high quality versus low quality data. Low quality data, there'd be a lot of gaps in it. There'd be limitations. There'd be questions around the data. Whereas high quality clinical data, you know, it's been gathered in a controlled environment. It's very reliable. So we know we can rely on the conclusions, etc., etc. Quantity, it's volume is what you're talking about. So it's looking at the number of patients that you have data on. So how many data points do you have? Number of publications. And then importantly, is it representative of all the indications, all the patient populations, etc., that are covered by your medical device? So sometimes what we see is that manufacturers think more of volume over quality. So we get lots and lots of data, but there's lots of holes in the data and it doesn't really tell you anything. It's not very reliable. So it's better to have a lower volume of high quality data from which you can draw accurate and reliable conclusions. That's what you're trying to do here. And that's what sufficient clinical evidence is about. You need to be able to draw reliable, valid conclusions that you can stand over. And to do that, you need enough high quality data. The MDR says ultimately it is up to the manufacturer to justify how much clinical evidence they need. There is some guidance in MDCG 2020-1 again on this that talks about sufficiency of clinical evidence for software as a medical device. It is worth having a look at that. There's a list of questions to ask yourself in order to determine, is it of sufficient quantity and is it of sufficient quality? So again, that's very useful to have a look at. So now I'll just go through 2 case study examples. And Katie, I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, probably going over time, but I'll keep going. This is, so the first example here, so I just wanted to talk through a couple of examples and just show you the type of evidence that was used to support them. So again, this is a drug management workflow type software. And essentially, it's a web-based application. It's used in a hospital and it's used to help in the management of drug therapy, supports doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and health company administrators at every stage of the drug supply chain. It's a Class 2A. The intended purpose is that it manages the workflow of drugs from the prescription by the doctor to administration by the nurses to the patient. There's no indications. You can use it to do prescriptions for any type of medical condition. The benefits are, I'll just scroll down, the benefits are that you get a reduction in prescription errors. It eliminates eligibility issues and the need for transcription, reduces risks of cognitive errors, reduces human error in the phases of prescription, composition, and administration. As with every device, there is risks associated with it. So you can get overdose or underdose due to human error during use of the device, or there can be incorrect dose calculation by the device. So it's essentially a prescription or a prescribing software. That's what it's doing. So the type of data that they provided, again, it's a simple device. There was already validated clinical formulas for dose calculation and reference databases for drug information. So reference databases are available to pull all the information about the drugs. The calculations are already there our formulas are already there to calculate your dose. So for this one, what they did was they had to demonstrate that the device correctly, reliably, repeatably generates the intended technical output from the input, technical performance. And they did this using IEC 82304 in accordance with IEC 62304. They also had usability data. They had PMS data because it was a legacy device. And they had planned to do PMCF activities. So they're doing level 8 user surveys and scientific literature screening to identify cases of misuse or off-label use. So this particular device was approved under Article 6110. The next one then, it's a little bit more complex. It's a radiological image analysis software. So again, it's an AI-driven device. So we're going up a level now. This one has incorporated AI. It aids in the clinical assessment of chest x-rays and non-contrast CT brain cases. The algorithm itself uses deep learning techniques to generate case level predictions or chest x-rays and brain, CT brain scans. So it's predicting, so this is predicting different types of diseases based on an X-ray image of either your chest or the brain. That's what it's doing. The viewer displays the suspected findings and localization in its own window so that the user can look at the original images concurrently. The important thing is what they've said here is this isn't intended to provide direct diagnosis. We see that a lot with software as a medical device. So it doesn't provide direct diagnosis. Qualified clinicians who interpret these X-rays and or brain scans as part of their scope of practice ultimately hold responsibility for interpreting the studies. So this is a class 2B, so it's a higher risk class. The intended purpose is it's intended to assist clinicians with the interpretation of radiological imaging studies and provide notification of suspected findings. Its indications, it identifies suspected findings in digested chest X-ray studies of adult patients. And if I remember correctly, there is over 103 different diseases that it would pick up. And also in non-contrast brain CT scans, I think there is 50 something diseases that it would pick up. The intended user, you had to be a trained clinician who is qualified to interpret chest X-rays and or CT scans. Benefits are that it improves clinical accuracy in detecting pathology on a medical image, reduces the time to report studies that contain critical pathology, and reduces per study interpretation time. So again, if you just notice the benefits there, they're very much about like providing information. So it's by providing the information that we're getting the benefits. The key risks are that you could have a delay in diagnosis due to incorrect findings, a delay in the actual clinical workflow that it's going to sit in, display of findings related to incorrect studies. You could have errors in clinical interpretation. And then you could have incorrect diagnosis due to an error in clinical interpretation. So the clinician doesn't read the results correctly or misinterprets the results. So for this one, you probably can get a feel for, oh, this is much more higher risk. There is bigger implications of something going wrong here with this particular device. So there's a lot more data needed. So they did, for their technical performance, they did their software testing and verification using 62304, 62366. They also did standalone model evaluations using a ground truth data set labeled by specialist radiologists. So these are their training data sets. So they trained the algorithm using pre-labeled images, and then they had another data set again that were pre-labeled, and they used those as their test data set that they ran through the trained algorithm. They then did a retrospective non-inferior evaluation. So we're moving now into the clinical performance is where is what we're looking at here. So they looked at if you have the software as a medical device on its own, compare it to just the human doing the same job. So how does the software on its own compare to the human? That was one study that they did. The next study that they did was an open label, multi-reader, multi-case retrospective study where they had pre-labeled samples. So we knew the truth, they were known truth. They gave them to multiple different centers. I think they had over 30 different clinicians reading them, and they ran them through the software versus not running them through the software and compared the results and found out that when you had them running through the software, your results were much more accurate. They had the device launched in Australia. So they had real world evidence from Australia, and they went out, they gathered that in a study, and they were able to demonstrate that that data was relevant to the EU population. So they had that data as well. And then they had planned to do PMCF studies. So once the device is on the market in Europe, they had studies planned where they wanted to demonstrate that the device leads to improved performance of radiologists when it's in use in Europe, because that's what they had seen in Australia. They wanted to demonstrate the same thing in Europe, that it detects findings that are missed by radiologists, again in the European population, and they wanted to look at the triage functionality, how it influenced the reporting time of time-sensitive findings in a real-world setting in the European population. So again, they had very specific objectives. It was all about gathering data on how this device actually performs in the EU market. So they were leveraging data from other jurisdictions, showed it was relevant to the EU, and then we're getting data from the EU market itself. So you can see the difference between the two different types of devices, all based on what is it actually meant to be doing, what is the impact on the patient if the results are incorrect, and so on. So once you have your clinical data, you then look at all of your evidence and you have to do your benefit risk evaluation. So I have a little image here on the left-hand side just to try and show what you're trying to show here. So on the top one, we have, so this is what the state of the art might look like. We start with unhappy patient because they're sick. They get assessed, diagnosed, treated, hopefully happy patient. So by adding in our software as a medical device to this clinical care pathway, we might be adding in a screening step, so a pre-step. So we're going to screen the patients, triage them, essentially. Then they go through assessment, diagnosis, treatment. We might be modifying one of the steps. So we might be, as part of the diagnosis, adding in AI to aid diagnosis, or we might be completely changing the process by taking the human out and putting in AI to replace assessment and diagnosis. So you have to be very clear on what exactly is my device doing to the clinical care pathway and how does it compare back to state of the art. So what you need to do is, compared to state of the art, clearly show what impact does the introduction of the software have on the patient. Can you demonstrate that the benefits outweigh the risks? And the risks are misdiagnosis due to false positive, false negatives, delay in treatment. You need to demonstrate that all unfavorable and favorable data is expected to be disclosed and evaluated, and you may need to reevaluate your intended purpose. So the last step then is your post-market surveillance. So we're nearly there. We'll just about hit the hour. So once the device then gets onto the market, again, you don't just leave it out into the Wild West. You have to continue to gather data on your device to demonstrate that throughout its lifetime, the device is performing as expected. So that's what post-market surveillance is. So you're looking at all of your complaints, your vigilance data, you're going out talking to your customers and the clinicians that are using the software, gathering feedback, constantly screening literature, looking what's happening with similar devices. You may need to do some PMCF studies to gather new clinical data, and it's just about gathering data generated from use of your device in the real world. And then you feed that data back into your clinical evaluation and use it to update it. So that's what I'm showing here on the last slide, that we start with a clinical evaluation plan, we generate our report. Then when the device is on the market, we're collecting post-market surveillance data, we're doing vigilance reports, trend reports, and so on. We're analysing that data, It's used to update our risk management, our IFU, design development, and so on. But you're also feeding it back into your clinical evaluation and using it to update your clinical evaluation plans and reports. And the whole cycle starts again. And if you remember from the clinical evaluation process, one of the steps is identify what data you have, then you appraise it. So this is the new data that you're going to be getting, and you appraise it, you analyze it, and feed it back in. So I do have a couple of slides in here on AI, but just in the interest of time, I won't go through them, but they will be in the slide deck that Katie will be able to provide at the end of today. And the last thing I just wanted to show you was at BSI, we do have a lot of resources available for software as a medical device. So there's a couple of webinars available that you can go in and download. So you can watch the webinars or download the presentations. So I have the links for those on the left. There's also, for the MDCG documents, they have a whole series of documents on how you regulate software as a medical device. This one here, MDCG 2020-1, is probably one of the best ones. It's the ones that I use most often. And 2019-11 is also very good. And then at BSI, we're also writing a guidance paper at the moment, which is going to give a lot more detail on how to do clinical evaluation for software as a medical device. And it is due out in Q1 2026.